Hi there, and welcome to this data and research drop, which I've entitled The State of Behaviour, and the data that I'm going to show you here is all based around suspensions. Now, for this, I'm going to look at mainstream secondary schools, but if you do work in a primary setting, I can tell you that the shapes that you're going to see in the data today are very much mirrored within primary school, just at a lower level because fewer suspensions and exclusions happen in primary. Okay, let's get started. So what is a suspension rate? Well, basically, if you have a school of, say, 500 students and you give out 50 suspensions in one academic year, then you would have a suspension rate of 10%. So it doesn't matter whether those suspensions went to one student or whether they went to 200 students. It's literally just a combination of your head count and the number of suspensions that were given out. So what we have here is the suspension rate as an average for all the mainstream secondary schools in England. And if you come from here to here, you can see that before the pandemic, the rates tended to fluctuate between about 11% and about 7%. When it comes to the pandemic, there was a big drop. A lot of that could probably be attributed to the fact that there were far fewer students in school, whether or not they had COVID, whether they were shielding vulnerable adults at home. There was a steep drop in both the permanent exclusion data and the suspension data for these 2 years. But what we're looking at today is the 2021-22 data, and here we have a really steep rise at about 14%. So the first thing to note about that is that it is in fact the highest that we've had certainly in the last 15 years. It may be the highest suspension rate that we've had since the Department for Education started producing data, because the suspension data started after the permanent exclusion data, but we can see it's certainly the highest for a very, very long time. Second thing to recognise about this data is that it's actually following the pattern of an increase that started before the pandemic. So if I just draw a line coming out from here, you can see that if that rise had continued, it still would have been a higher rate than what we had in 2006, 2007. You can see from here, it still would have been high, but I would suggest that possibly we've gone even beyond that, which does beg the question, why? In my personal opinion, I don't think all of this rise can be put down to the pandemic. I think there's probably a combination of things, but we certainly have had years of austerity. We've had a building cost of living crisis, and there's definitely an association between income and suspensions. And in order to make that point, I'd like to show you a different graph on the next slide. So whether suspensions are high or low in any given year, they're never spread equally across our school cohort in England. And the reason I can say that is because there's something that they correlate really well to every single year. And that's something called IDACI, or at least certainly that's how I say it. So you can see that's down there on the x-axis of the graph. So what does that mean? Well, that stands for Income Deprivation Affecting Children Index. And when we plot all the suspension rates against that, every year we have a really, really strong correlation to both suspensions and permanent exclusions. So just to explain how this graph works, every school gets a score or gets put inside one of these 10 boxes, with box 1 being all the schools who are the least affluent, and box 10 being the schools who are the most affluent. So it's literally based on pupil demographics. And every year you get a nice downward slant with lots of data points that are very close to the line. So we can see here in 2021-22, the schools that were ranked 1, they had an average suspension rate of about 14%. And then down here with the schools that were ranked as the most affluent, it was about maybe 5.5 or 5%. So there's quite a big difference. But the other thing that strikes me about this graph every single year is that there's not really a point where it drops off and you can say, okay, at this point, that's where the impact of something like poverty kicks in. It is always superbly correlated, which in effect is saying that it's not just extreme affluence that matters for this kind of data, and it's not just extreme poverty. What actually matters is all the steps in between. So it's a very interesting graph every single year, and that does give us some insight into some of the main factors which impact on behaviour in our school system. So another way of demonstrating this difference is to look at students who have been eligible for free school meals, or rather have registered for free school meals within the last 6 years. The reason I say registered and not eligible is that not all students who are eligible for free school meals have gone through the process and registered for various reasons. But what we have here is, if you look at the blue lines or the blue bars on this chart, they're the group of students who have been eligible for free school meals in the last 6 years. So you can see over here in 2013-14, they had a suspension rate, or an average suspension rate, of 16%. And if we look at 21-22, we are just under 35%. So that's obviously a really, really big increase. Now, if you look at the orange bars on the charts, they are the suspension rates of all of the students in that year who have not been registered for free school meals within the last 6 years. And obviously immediately you can see the numbers are much lower. However, I've always been interested in the difference. So essentially what I did is subtract one bar from the other bar on this chart. And if you look at these data points here, that is the difference in suspension rates. So in 2013-14, the difference was about 12% in the suspension rate between those two groups. And when we come to 21-22, it is almost 26%. So that clearly has been growing and growing. So what I would say we can learn from this graph is that the suspension gap is at its widest, and it has more than doubled since 2013-14. Now, I was kind of torn about what to describe this as. These two groups are frequently compared in education. So when it comes to academic outcomes, we call it the attainment gap. So we need really a term for this. Is it the suspension gap? Is it the punishment gap? Is it the behaviour gap? But really the reason we need a name is because this is something that we need to be talking about a lot more. One more thing to note, it's clear that not only is it high, but it is following the pattern of a pre-pandemic increase. So we had a worsening situation before the pandemic, and now it does seem to have been perhaps even exacerbated by that. So the last slide I'm going to show you is something I like to look at, which is essentially the range. There are almost no schools at secondary level that don't have any suspensions in a year. It doesn't matter if it's a selective girls' school, they still have typically a few suspensions in a year. And the very, very small number of schools that don't tend to use other methods instead of suspension. So at the bottom end, the range is 0, but I'm also interested sometimes in the outliers, and that's the absolute top end of the data. So if we have a look at this graph here, I created this on the basis of 10 secondary schools. I'm not going to tell you which ones they are, but I chose them specifically because they had the highest suspension rates that I could find in the data. So just to give you some idea here, you can see the top end, we have suspension rates of about 400%. To put that in context, these black dots that are close to the x-axis, that's the national average. So you can see the national average for 2017-18 was down here, and you can see there was quite a few schools on this graph who are an awful lot higher than that. So what does this mean in terms of the 2021-22 data? Well, the highest suspension rate that I could see in a mainstream secondary school was actually 255%. So here we've got 250. You can see it's probably just above this line here. Now, to give you some idea of what that kind of equates to actually on the ground, the school that had a suspension rate of 255% had 745 students, and in that year gave out 1,900 suspensions. And I think that kind of brings it home if you consider that that was a rate of 255%, and here we have schools that are considerably higher than that. So it really is quite an absurdly high number of suspensions for the head count in these schools. One more thing that I'd say about this graph when I put it together is that I think there's a bit of a fallacy in education that if you have extraordinarily high suspension rates, that will somehow fix behaviour quite rapidly, whereas anyone who's actually looked at the data can see that schools who do take that approach tend to maintain it for quite a long period of time, over a few years. So for example, if you see this orange line here, it shoots up been about national average. It shoots up to about 125%. Then we go all the way up to 400. Then by the time they get to 2018-19, yes, it started to come down, but it's still over 200%. And none of these schools the year after a big increase come anywhere near national average. So I think that's something which kind of needs to be corrected in the general mindset when we talk about using very high suspensions as a strategy to rapidly improve behaviour. These schools are not demonstrating that certainly that their behaviour is normalised within their context. So I hope that some of that was interesting. I love to look at data and research, and I tend to use it in my consultancy, in my speaking, and in my training. So if you are interested in any of that, please get in touch at catsternconsultancy@gmail.com. And just before I go, I'm going to plug my book, which has just under 500 references, most of which are from peer-reviewed journals in it. And that's The Excludables: From Mainstream Classroom to Prison Education. Okay, take care, and I'll see you at the next data and research drop.